The year was 1970. Not a significant year in any obvious sense. No Great War ending. No landmark discovery announced to the world. Just another turn of the calendar in a decade that had already delivered more than its share of upheaval and left people slightly less certain about the things they had been taught to believe without question. But in the particular rooms, in gymnasiums, and late-night conversations of the combat world, 1970 was the year a question had begun to travel. The question was not new. It had been circling for years, gaining weight the way certain ideas gain weight when the world starts to feel ready for them. It moved through boxing gyms and martial arts schools and the back corners of sports bars where men who had spent their lives hitting things argued about what hitting things actually meant in any real sense. The question was simple. Could it survive? Could this Eastern thing, this kung fu, this philosophy dressed in movement and tradition and ceremony, could it survive contact with something uncooperative? With real weight, real power, real violence delivered without ritual or spiritual pretense by a man who had not agreed in advance to fall down at the appropriate moment. Most fighters already had their answer. They carried it the way men carry conclusions drawn from evidence. Quietly, with the satisfaction of someone who has done the work and arrived somewhere defensible. The answer was no. William Cross had been the answer to a lot of questions in his life. 6'3", 240 pounds, assembled over 2 decades in gyms that did not have mirrors or motivational posters on the walls. Only the particular education available to a man willing to be hit and hit and hit until the lesson landed somewhere permanent. 14 years as a professional heavyweight. 31 wins. 26 knockouts. A record that was not simply numbers. It was a biography written in the accumulated inability of other men to remain standing after he had decided they should not be standing anymore. He was not cruel the way some fighters are cruel. Cruelty requires something personal, some investment in the suffering. Cross had no such investment. He was something quieter and more thorough than cruel. He was certain, and certainty in a man who can end your night with a single decision is its own category of force. He had studied every system, every style, every variation on the fundamental question of how one human being brings another to the ground in a confined space with no assistance. He had an opinion about all of it, and his opinion was built on evidence in the way that opinions built on evidence resist being argued away by theory or tradition or the testimony of men who had never tested their understanding against someone who was actively trying to take it apart. The opinion about martial arts was not a performance. It was a conclusion arrived at honestly after years of observation. He had watched the demonstrations. He had seen the films. He had read the articles written by men who seemed genuinely moved by things that moved beautifully under controlled conditions against cooperative partners in rooms where everyone had agreed beforehand what the outcome would look like. He had seen the philosophy and the tradition and the ceremony and had waited, with the patience of a man who understood waiting, for someone to explain what any of it would do when the ceremony ended, and what remained was 2 men and nothing between them, but the oldest question there is. No one had explained it in a way that satisfied the evidence. So he had drawn his own conclusion, and he had said so, publicly, clearly, with the straightforward confidence of a man who expected to be challenged and had prepared his entire body for the challenge. The night itself was a Friday in November. A promoter who ran championship events in his city the way certain men run small institutions, with absolute authority and a precise understanding of what his audience required, had put the card together over 6 weeks. He had heard about Bruce Lee the way most of the entertainment world had heard about Bruce Lee by 1970, through stories that seemed impossible, through demonstrations that defied comfortable explanation, through a name that had begun accumulating the particular gravity that names acquire when the person behind them has done something the world cannot fully categorize. The invitation had been straightforward. Come to the fight. Watch from ringside. Be available for a demonstration afterward. Bring nothing but yourself. Bruce Lee had accepted. He arrived the evening before the fight. Alone. A single leather bag. A dark jacket over a plain shirt. No publicist, no handler, no entourage arranged to signal importance by its presence. He walked the city for 2 hours that Thursday evening, not as a tourist covers ground, but as a man reads something he is genuinely trying to understand. The quality of a city reveals itself in small things, in how people move on cold streets when they are not being observed, in what they expect from the Friday nights they have worked all week toward, in what they demand from the rooms they enter. This city demanded something real, not the appearance of real, the actual thing. He understood that. It was not different from other things he understood. The main event was William Cross against a challenger from the West Coast, whose name has since been claimed by the particular amnesia that falls over men who lose badly in front of large crowds. Cross removed him in the second round with a right hand that arrived from an angle nobody anticipated and departed carrying everything it had been promised. The crowd, several thousand people packed into a building whose walls had absorbed the specific atmosphere of every fight it had ever held, gave Cross the reception that a city reserves for a man it has decided belongs to it by right of performance, by the accumulated evidence of years of arriving and doing exactly what was needed and leaving without apology. He stood in the center of the ring, championship belt in his left hand, microphone extended to him from the side. He began with what everyone expected: gratitude to the crowd, acknowledgement of the city, the language of a man performing the ritual of victory in the room that most understood and appreciated that ritual. The crowd responded warmly, the sound of thousands of people confirming their own good judgment about who deserved their loyalty. Then Cross said something that was not part of the ritual. He said he had been thinking. He said that something had been bothering him for some time, and that he had decided tonight was the appropriate occasion to say the thing he actually thought rather than the thing that had been prepared for him. The crowd shifted slightly. The particular quality of attention in a room changes when someone with real authority steps off the prepared path. What I do, Cross said, is real. This ring is real. The men I fight are real. The damage is real. And what I have watched from this Eastern fighting, from this tradition of martial arts that keeps appearing in magazines and films and conversations as though it deserves to be discussed alongside what happens in professional competition, is a beautiful performance that has nothing to do with what happens when the performance ends, and what is left is two men who have agreed that only one of them can win. He paused. His voice through the speakers had the quality of a man who had rehearsed nothing because he did not need to rehearse what he had already decided. I have said this privately for years. Tonight I am saying it plainly. Martial arts is not fighting. It is theater that describes fighting. The people who teach it understand this. They understand it every time the demonstration requires a cooperative partner who has agreed in advance to receive the technique. They understand it every time someone asks them why they have never tested their system against a man who had not agreed to the outcome. And they answer with philosophy, because philosophy is the only thing available when evidence is not. He raised the belt above his head. I am standing in this ring right now. If any person in this building practices any martial art, any style, any tradition, any system that its practitioners believe to be real, the ring is open. Come up. I will give you the first move. I will stand completely still and let you establish whatever you need. Because I can afford to give you every advantage I have, and it will change nothing. The result will be the same. This is not an insult. This is arithmetic. Size, weight, power, experience, and the specific absence of any restraint that ceremony requires. That is not a contest. That is an outcome. He lowered the belt. The building was quiet. Several thousand people, and the kind of silence that arrives not when nothing is being thought, but when so many things are being thought simultaneously that they cancel each other into stillness. Is there anyone here? Cross said, or does everyone in this building already know the answer? In the seventh row, Bruce Lee had not moved. He had sat through the entire evening with the same expression he had carried through the lobby and down the aisle and into his seat. Still, focused. The expression not of a man watching entertainment, but of a man receiving information that he intends to do something with. He had listened to Cross the way he listened to everything in a room. Completely. Without the interruption of his own opinion arriving before the information had finished delivering itself. But something had shifted in the quality of his stillness. There is a particular kind of stillness that belongs to a man who has decided something. It is recognizably different from the stillness of waiting or the stillness of indifference. It is the stillness of a man who has already completed the action in every dimension that precedes the physical, and is now simply allowing time to move forward to the moment where his body confirms what has already been decided. The man sitting beside him registered the change before he consciously understood it. He turned. He saw Bruce Lee beginning to rise from his seat with the slow, deliberate movement of someone completing a motion that had been set in motion by something below conscious direction. His voice, unamplified, in a building constructed to absorb and redirect sound, carrying across several rows of crowded seats and 30 feet of open space to the ring, was heard by every person in the building. The silence made it possible. "I'm here." 2 words. They landed in the room with a weight disproportionate to their size. Cross heard them. The crowd heard them. Every person present turned toward their source, which was a man of medium height, standing in the 7th row in a dark jacket with his hands at his sides, looking toward the ring with the ease of someone who had arrived at this moment and found it arranged exactly as expected. Cross looked at him. Something moved through his expression that had nothing to do with the performance of the evening. Something more private. He was a fighter, and fighters have instincts that operate below the level of what they choose to think. That instinct, in this moment, was sending information that Cross was choosing, for now, to set aside. "Come up then," he said. Bruce Lee walked toward the ring with nothing in the walk that was for anyone watching. No acknowledgement of the crowd around him. No adjustment of posture for the attention that had turned entirely in his direction. He moved through the space between his row and the ring apron the way a man moves towards something that has always been waiting for him, with a pace that was neither urgent nor reluctant, simply continuous. The crowd made room not because he asked for it, but because the quality of his movement made space around it as a simple and obvious fact. He climbed the ring steps. He ducked through the ropes. He stood in the center of the ring and looked at William Cross, and 3,000 people looked at both of them, and the room reached a quality of silence that had no comparison in the evening behind it. The contrast in physical scale was close to abstract. Cross at 6'3" and 240 pounds of assembled mass built and tested over decades of professional combat, and across from him a man standing in a dark jacket with his hands at his sides, still, completely unburdened by any need to announce what he was. Cross studied him the way fighters study men they are trying to read, searching for the alignment between confidence and physical reality that reveals whether a man truly understands the room he has walked into, or has simply chosen to walk in regardless of understanding. The small failures of posture or weight distribution or eye contact that experienced fighters find in men who have been confident in the wrong rooms before. He found nothing he expected to find. The nothing was, itself, information. He chose to proceed. He said, "I said what I said because I believe it. If you want to show me I was wrong, I am genuinely interested in watching you try." Bruce Lee said nothing for a moment. The moment lasted long enough that it was its own kind of statement. Then he said, "You were answering the wrong question." Cross looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means the question was never whether any particular style could defeat any other particular style. You were building certainty on top of a question that was never precise enough to build anything true on." Cross felt something move through him that he recognized with enough experience to name. Not fear. The adjacent thing. The involuntary recalibration that happens when something you have already placed and categorized in your mind refuses to remain in the category. "Then what is the question?" he said. "Whether you are fighting the man who is standing in front of you," Bruce Lee said, "or the man you have already decided is standing in front of you." The referee stepped forward with the professional instinct of a man whose function exists for exactly this kind of threshold. Whatever had begun in words was preparing to continue in something more physical. His job was to ensure that the physical continuation had structure around it. He looked at Bruce Lee. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" "Yes." He looked at Cross. Cross nodded once. His body had already moved past the part of the process that involved words. 23 years of accumulated training. Every fight and every sparring session and every lesson that had ended with him understanding something painful. All of it had organized itself toward the familiar task with the quiet efficiency of machinery that knows its purpose. He came forward with the measured control of a craftsman who respects his work enough to begin it properly. The jab extended first, not as an attack in the true sense, but as a question delivered in the language of his specific expertise. A request for information. Range, reaction time, the particular speed and decision-making of the man across from him. The jab found nothing. Not because it was redirected or blocked, because the position it traveled toward no longer contained what it had been aimed at. Bruce Lee had moved forward and slightly left, inside the arc of the punch, into the gap between when the punch committed and when it arrived, close enough that the motion of Cross's forearm passed over his shoulder as it extended past the space he had just vacated. In that gap, measured in fractions of a second, while Cross's weight was fully committed forward to a punch that had found nothing, Bruce Lee hit him. One shot. The sound it made was different from every other sound the building had produced that evening. Clean. Complete. The specific acoustic signature of force that has arrived at its destination with full efficiency and zero waste. Nothing spent on announcement. Everything delivered on contact. Cross's head moved back. His legs, which had held him upright through 31 professional fights and more than 2 decades of physical education and pain, sent a message to his brain that they were revising their capacity to perform their current function. His knees buckled. He went down. Not the controlled descent of a man choosing the canvas as a tactical decision. The fall of a man whose nervous system has received information it cannot immediately process and has concluded that proximity to the ground is the most sensible response while it works through the implications. He stayed down for 8 seconds. He got up on his own. His legs answered. His eyes found the ring and then found Bruce Lee, who had not moved from the position from which the punch had been thrown, who stood with his right hand returned to his side and his expression unchanged from before the punch and after it, and his breathing entirely unaltered by what had just happened. The crowd produced a sound that had no established vocabulary in the context of sporting events. Not a roar. Not the release of anticipated outcome. Something more confused and more honest. The sound of several thousand people finding that the map they had been certain about did not match the territory they were standing in. Cross stood in the ring for a long moment. His corner men entered through the ropes. His trainer reached him and said something directly into his ear with the urgency of a man delivering information he believes is critical. Cross didn't respond. He was looking at Bruce Lee with the expression of a man encountering an answer to a question he had believed he had already answered and closed. He walked to the center of the ring. He stood in front of Bruce Lee and looked at him for several seconds without speaking. Then he said, quietly, without a microphone, to the man directly in front of him, "I was wrong." Bruce Lee held the look without performing anything in return. No celebration. No demonstration of what winning was supposed to look like. He said, "You were fighting a story. Most people are." Cross absorbed this. Then he said, "What story?" "The story that certainty is the same as understanding. That everything you have not yet encountered does not exist. That the boundary of your experience is the boundary of what is possible." Cross was quiet. "Then, how do you stop fighting a story? You stop expecting the man in front of you to behave like the men you have already met. You stop competing against your memory of previous fights and start engaging the one that is actually happening right now. Most of what defeats people has nothing to do with their opponent. It is their commitment to what they already know at the expense of what is true." Cross held a press conference 4 days later. He kept the word he had given in the ring, standing in front of journalists and cameras with the same directness he had used to say everything he had ever said publicly. He had been wrong. About martial arts, about what he understood, about the nature of what he had been so certain was theater. He owed a public correction to every person he had dismissed with a confidence that had not been earned by the evidence he believed it had been built upon. He never fought professionally again. Not because of anything the punch had done to his body. His body required 3 days to return to normal function. It was because of what had been done to something that was not physical. He had spent 14 years constructing a professional understanding on a premise he had never fully tested because he had never needed to. He had been certain, and the certainty had felt like knowledge in the way that certainty always feels like knowledge from the inside. And it had never occurred to him that the feeling of certainty and the fact of understanding were not the same thing. One punch had revealed the distance between them. You cannot rebuild on that foundation after it has been shown insufficient. You can only acknowledge what has been revealed and begin again from a position of actual honesty, which is a different and more difficult starting point than the certainty that preceded it. He told his trainer privately that he respected Bruce Lee in a way he could not fully explain through any language the sport had given him. Not for the punch. A punch is a punch. He respected what Bruce Lee had done before the punch. He had walked into a room full of people who had already decided what he was and had simply been present, patiently, until the moment when the decision those people had already made could meet something real. He had not needed the crowd to witness it. He had not needed the outcome to be documented. He had stood up from his seat and walked toward the ring with the calm of a man who already knows what is true and has no investment in performing the knowing. He was simply offering the room a chance to catch up to something that had been true the entire evening, before anyone in the building had been ready to see it. Bruce Lee was gone before the building finished processing what it had witnessed. He checked out of his hotel before dawn. He left no note and made no statement, and carried the same leather bag and dark jacket he had carried into the city, and his expression was the expression of a man for whom what had occurred in that ring was not an event in the sense that events are distinguished from the continuous flow of living. It was the natural surface expression of something that had always been true, briefly becoming visible to a room full of people who had required that it become visible before they could see it. He never mentioned the evening in any interview. He never claimed the story as his, because the story did not belong to him. It belonged to Cross, and to every person who had been in that building, and to everyone who would eventually receive it through the transmission that stories of this particular kind use, not through publications or official documentation, but through the slow, persistent movement of people who were present and could not fully explain what they had witnessed, but found that they could not stop returning to the question of what it meant. Because what they had witnessed was not a fight. A fight is a contest between two men with a result that belongs to sport. What they had witnessed was a collision between two ways of moving through the world, between a man who had mastered the known and a man who had mastered the willingness to meet the unknown without flinching, between the force that accumulates in certainty and the force that accumulates in remaining permanently open to the actual truth of what is present. One of those forces has a ceiling. The other one does not. Cross became a teacher. Not immediately. It took time to understand what had been given to him in that ring, because gifts that arrive through humiliation require more time to unwrap than the kind that arrive through success. He taught for the rest of his working life, and those who learned from him said consistently that he taught differently from the teachers who had never been broken by a better understanding. He taught from after the collapse. He taught from the specific knowledge of what it costs to confuse the feeling of certainty with the possession of truth. His students, in the years that followed, would sometimes ask him about the greatest night of his career. He never named any of the 31 wins. He named a Friday night in November when a man he had underestimated in every possible dimension stood up from a seat in the 7th row and walked toward him and said 2 words. "I'm here." And everything that followed was simply time allowing the world to confirm what had been true the entire evening, before anyone in the building was prepared to see it. Some lessons cost nothing to receive. They arrive through years of quiet accumulation and settle into understanding the way things settle when they have been earned at the right pace and in the right order. Other lessons cost something that cannot be calculated in any ordinary currency. They require that the thing you were most certain about be demonstrated insufficient. Not in private, where the lesson could be absorbed quietly and rebuilt upon honestly. In public, in a room built for the specific purpose of demonstrating which understanding was more true. In front of thousands of people who had come to witness confirmation of what they already believed, and instead witnessed the collapse of a certainty they had borrowed from a man they trusted. Those lessons, the ones that cost the most, produce the most permanent change. They do not simply alter what you know. They alter the architecture through which you know anything at all. And that is the full distance between a man who lost a fight one Friday night and a man who was, at considerable cost, and in full public view, finally and permanently corrected. Cross spent the rest of his life grateful for it, in the particular quiet way that a man is grateful for something that arrived in a form he would not have chosen but that proved, over the years, to be exactly what was required. The man who had provided the correction was already on a plane heading west before the city had finished processing what it had seen, reading, with the same expression he had carried into the city and through the fight and out the other side. The buildings below receding into the particular darkness that cities were before dawn, indifferent and permanent, and already forgetting what had happened within them the way all rooms eventually forget what they have held. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him that required looking at. The work was the work. The truth was the truth. What happened when they met in a specific room on a specific night was never the point of either of them. It was simply what happens when a man who has stopped performing what he knows meets a man who has been certain about the wrong things for just long enough to believe the certainty has been earned. one punch, one silence, and the long, permanent education that followed.